stand up here to get to the microphone. I also want to just thank everybody for being here. This is an event that we've been thinking about for a while, so it's great to have a number of people here to hear what I think is a very unique perspective on Israel-Palestine and claims of belonging. I want to thank Theodore Parker Church for having this event here. It's not every church that would have an event like this in their parish hall. We have a group of people here that have formed a group called Diana's List to work on Middle East issues. I don't know if anyone here knew Diana Diggs. Anybody? She was for a very long time a human rights activist, lived in Jamaica Plain, and was part of this community. And she really had a gift for getting people in conversation about issues in the Middle East in ways that broke down some of the polarization that's so typical in these kind of conversations. She passed away in 2022, and I think we really carry her example and her energy in trying to do this work. So we want to remember Diana tonight. It's also typical at UU churches at this moment to do what's called a land acknowledgement, correct? We say that we acknowledge that we're on unceded land of the Massachusetts people here, which is kind of a polite way of saying land taken by force from Native people. And usually we make that land acknowledgement and then we proceed to have our event. And in a sense, that's what we're going to do tonight. But I want us to just take 30 seconds now to spend a moment just reflecting ourselves about what our situation on this land does to affect our thinking about the conversation we're going to have tonight. That is, how does our situation in Massachusetts alter or influence the way we think about Israel-Palestine issues? So just a second to reflect on that, please. UUs are very good at letting moments of reflection go uncomfortably long, so I'll let that not happen this time. But thank you for taking a moment to think about that. Music is a very big part of the life of this community. Anytime we come together, we try and do something that makes reference to that, the importance of music in our collective lives. So tonight, one of our co-sponsoring organizations, the Community Church of Boston, and its Beacon of Light, Dean Stevens, has agreed to do a song for us tonight to get us started. So Dean, if you'd come up here, we'd love to have you.
So glad to be with you and so glad to be opening for Linda. Her book has meant an enormous amount to me. I read it cover to cover and then read half of it again, and have bought 5 copies and given a couple of them away and have the other 3 for some other people I have in mind. So this event means a lot to me. I woke up this morning, none of the news was good. Death machines were rumbling across the land where Jesus stood. And the man on the TV told me that it had always been that way, and there was nothing anyone could do or say. And I almost listened to him, and I almost lost my mind, and then I regained my senses again. Looked into my heart to find, and I believe there'll come a day when the children of Abraham will lay down their swords forever in Jerusalem. Maybe I'm only dreaming. Maybe I'm just a fool, but I don't remember learning how to hate in Sunday school. And somewhere along the way I strayed, and I never looked back again. But I still find some comfort now and then. And the drums are drumming again. And I can't lay me down, and the thunder is rumbling again. And I can't stand the sound, and I believe that one fine day the lion and the lamb will lay down in peace together in Jerusalem. There will be no barricades then. There will be no wire walls, and we can wash this blood from our hands and this hatred from our hearts. And I believe there'll come a day when the children of Abraham will lay down their swords forever in Jerusalem. I believe there'll come a day that the children of Abraham will lay down in peace together in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, 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 Jerusalem. I have another one for Kevin.
Okay, thank you. It was lovely.
Position for you there.
I think so. Thanks.
And this one for Kevin.
Talk about the chief cook and bottle washer. Somebody's got to do it. It's true.
Long enough on the other side.
Well, after that song, we can probably stand up and go home. But we are going to continue. And I think everybody's... Sorry?
That's always, I'm sorry, I didn't say. Steve Earle is the author of that amazing song.
Thanks, Dean. So now we're going to turn our attention to what brought us all here tonight, which is a conversation with Linda Dittmar about her book. Cindy mentioned earlier that the way we're going to handle, we know there'll be questions. The way we're going to handle that is ask you to just jot your question down on the little cards, get it to one of the wonderful women with handfuls of cards, and we'll get them up here for Linda to answer them. In addition, Linda's going to do a little reading and a little talking about the book. So we're going to get started by me just asking Linda, please, would you do us, first of all, thank you for being here.
Can I first say thank you too?
Well, you can do whatever you want,
Yeah,
but
I do want to thank the church community for inviting me, and certainly Kevin for really being the main person who brought me here, and Cindy for her help, but all of you for attending. Okay.
so that's very nice. And I just want people to know it was a large group of people that put this together. Would everybody who's working on Deanna's list just raise your hand or stand up or something so people can see? This is really a group effort of a lot of people here at the church. So we're going to start out, Linda, by asking you just to tell us a little bit about yourself, your own, where you come from, how you came to this conversation, and how it is that this book came about. Please.
So I'm Israeli, you can hear it in my accent, And I came to the United States at the very end of 1960, and I was born in 1938, which means that during the war that defined the creation of the State of Israel, which the Israelis call the War of Independence and the Palestinians call the Nakba, which is a catastrophe, I was 10 years old. I grew up in Israel. I served in the IDF. I studied at the Hebrew University for a year and then came to study here in the United States. And for many years, I was involved in other social justice things in the United States. I mean, I came during the civil rights period, there was a Vietnam War and so on, but I really wasn't thinking much about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I kind of took completely for granted the standard Zionist narrative of that creation of the state, mainly that people were escaping persecution, which is completely correct. The United Nations voted to create a state, and from there on, basically the notion of the Zionism that came to Israel was that it was a land without people for a people without land. And also the other part of the narrative is that in 1948, all the Arab world, all the Arab countries surrounding little Israel attacked us, and there was a war which we won, and that's how we are there. And I completely uncritically accepted that story growing up. So the question is, what made me begin to question it? And there were two things that affected me initially. One of them was reading a wonderful book by an Israeli guy, Meron Ben-Venisti, who wrote an analysis of the Israeli appropriation of Palestinian lands and locations in Israel. And he was the first one to really talk, that I read, to talk about the Nakba, that catastrophe, which involved basically expulsion of some 750,000 Palestinians from Israel and the destruction of about 450 villages. So I knew about that, and in the book I describe a certain trip that I took early on with my then partner, and we were on a scenic drive through some forests, and what I discovered during that scenic drive was that there were memorial stones in the forest commemorating the Jewish community that donated money to plant that forest. And maybe some of you are part of that heritage, essentially, the Jewish National Fund forests. But what I already read in Ben-Venisti's book is that actually quite a lot of the forests were planted to cover up the remains of Palestinian villages, so that basically Kevin's point about think about here and think about there is very much connected, because we are in fact living on settled land that belonged to other people, and you have hardly any remnant to show that previous part of it. And in Israel, that's the case as well. Anyway, so there was that kind of forest, which was very gloomy and sobering to see one community after another memorialized, really, in that forest. But I also realized that the other side, the south side of the road where we were on, was the border of the occupied territories. And it was evening, and you could begin to see lights over there, and these were Palestinian places. And in fact, I wondered whether what we are seeing is Jenin, which is a particularly well-known Palestinian town in that region, because it was subject to many big attacks by Israeli army in Jenin. So there was that kind of conflict right on a very short, like a few miles worth of a road. And from there on, basically, I spent the next 4 years on and off with Deborah, going and trying to locate Palestinian villages, which is extremely, extremely hard to actually find them. And in 4 years, we managed to locate about 40 such villages. That is about 10%. And what we found very often was just a fragment of a wall or a well or something under bushes or under thorns, or maybe a minaret that is absorbed into a current modern architecture. So I don't know if to say anything more, but that is where this book came from. I just want you to know that I wrote it for about 10 years. It wasn't easy to write. And I finished writing it 3 years ago, which means that it's not about the current fighting in Gaza. It anticipates that and actually shows the road to what we have now. But I did not expect it when writing the book to be quite so bad. Yeah.
Thank you. So I know people came here expecting to hear you read a little bit from this book, so I wonder if you have a selection that you'd like to share with us to get us started. And remember, if you have questions, put them on the little cards and get them to folks.
Okay, so I'm going to read, I may read something else later, but this part is actually from the introduction, from the preface. Walking through...
Can people hear okay?
No, maybe I should. It's hard to see like that. Walking through a field or forest, you may come across the remains of a house, or perhaps a caved-in well, or an oil press overrun by brambles. In some places, the scent of wild thyme, za'atar, may reach you. In others, it might be the scent of newly planted pine trees or the pungent dust of grass disintegrating under the harsh sun. In late summer, figs and then pomegranates ripen when nobody is left to pick them. This is what my body registered on tours that I'll come to and talk about soon, but also on my own, during my childhood, and even now as I keep revisiting Israel. It is the language of the land on which is overlaid another language, that of the conscience. Speeding on Israel's paved roads, one rarely notices signs of the Nakba, even when some ruin or an abandoned tomb or mosque come into view, especially in built-up areas. They've been absorbed into Israel's evolving vernacular and ornamental architecture in ways that disguise what they are, let alone what they used to be. Does it matter that a lone fig tree happens to stand near a pile of stones in an empty field? Or that a lovely restaurant had once been a mosque? Or that a grocery in a small Israeli village built of beautifully chiseled stones used to be a Palestinian two-room schoolhouse? Once you know enough to notice the grafting of the new on the old, Israel no longer looks the same. Seen through the filter of the Nakba, both the bucolic beauty of its countryside and the dynamic effervescence of its modernity are shadowed by lives erased from that land that sustained them for centuries. Though proof of the Nakba was everywhere, it remained unnamed among us Israeli Jews, a forbidden zone where none was to enter. Victorious and aglow with accounts of Jewish heroism, our response to the Nazi atrocities that continue to scar our collective memory, we had only contempt for the people we called the Arabs, denying their local identity. Steeped in dread of the unknown ahead of us, the pre-48 Jewish population, the Yishuv, and the newly arrived Jewish refugees clung together in a desperate need to ensure our own survival. The Nakba was a ghostly presence we could not afford to see. I want to read one other section from this introduction, and that is about a tour that I went with a group here. The organization is called Zochrot. And we were visiting a village called Tarshiha, which is in the Western Galilee. Zohot is an organization that's devoted to commemorating the Nakba, and they actually locate such places and mark them, and they have a very detailed website, in fact. So we are walking in Tarshiha. Several small galleries participated in this event, often showing work in which the indigenous hard-to-eradicate prickly pear cactuses, sabras, serve as an icon of Palestinian resistance. There were landscape drawings where cactuses marked and eradicated villages, sculptures made from the plant's large succulent leaves, some wounded by cuts scored into their flesh. Included was also a glass book whose pages were transparent sheets of rough-edged glass bound with a cord, a palimpsest of receding layers of inscription whose razor-sharp edges deterred all but the brave. But what happened next is that we got to see a movie in that gathering. Made by Basil Tanus, a Tarshiha native, the film's title cites the village affectionate nickname, Bride of the Galilee, Arus al-Jalil. But it also referred to the film's protagonist, Fatma Hawari, who lost both her legs on her wedding day during an Israeli attack on the village in late October 1948. While the film celebrates both Fatma's and the village's resilience, its culminating moment occurs when years later she meets a pilot who bombed the village. This combat pilot was Abi Natan, who became notorious after I'd left Israel in 1960. Having seen the carnage that aerial bombing inflicted on another nearby village, he became a peace activist known between 1966 and 1993 for his Voice of Peace radio broadcast from a ship he kept in international waters. At some point, CNN crew filmed him and Fatma, both of them old by now, in an encounter included in Tanus's film. In this wrenching scene, we see Fatma visiting Abi, who's now paralyzed by a stroke. These two old, crippled enemies, each in a wheelchair, show a certain affection for each other, like an old couple. Yet they fail to reconcile, perhaps also like an old couple. Abi, slumped in his wheelchair, asks for forgiveness. Fatma, about to leave, says no with a bone-chilling smile I'll never forget, even as she pats his hand with consoling intimacy. I had no sense of the audience's true feeling about the film, neither Palestinians nor Jewish Israelis. There was an incident, a storekeeper gave me a free pen, a present, because I was there with that group. What might that storekeeper who gave me the pen think, I wondered, if he eventually closed his store and joined his neighbors for the film screening? Or what might she say, the artist who made the glass book that threatened to slice my fingers were I to dare turn a page? There was much applause as credits rolled, with smiling director present to receive the accolades. Some may have thought the woman was wrong to withhold forgiveness. Many may have thought she was right. Everybody was affable, as is generally the case on such occasions. I don't recall the Jewish visitors saying anything then or later, and what the Palestinians might have said in Arabic was opaque to me. I only remember my own paralysis and my sense of the chasm, the unhealed wounds separating us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that should give you a sense of the book that we're talking about tonight. We're now going to try something that I've seen done many times in Latin America, less in this context here. But what we would like to do is ask you to turn to somebody next to you and spend the next minute and a half to 2 minutes. If it's somebody you know, that's fine. Don't be afraid to speak to somebody that you don't know. And just talk for a moment about what the reading that Linda just completed brought to mind for you. Just a moment and a half, turn and cuchinchear.
Okay.
That was a great reading. Fantastic.
I hope there'll be time for another one. We'll see how it goes. Oh, thank you.
There will be. What do you think, Steve? What comes to mind when you hear this?
He can't hear you?
I remember one time it was mentioned to me that eventually maybe he became politically concerning when she was. She never mentioned that she was either a supporter or whatever or both any particular U.S. federal organization. Because I just attracted the name of the
We were both in City Life. That was our organization. She and I both were.
Was she surprised when you mentioned to her, if you did, that I was also mentioned?
She was very surprised by that, especially the Albanian thing back in those days.
When she owned City Lights, was that a union?
Oh, absolutely. She was a union. Absolutely.
International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Union Number 103?
Absolutely.
I remember finding out at somewhere that her union company got a union contract to do union electrical work.
That's right. All right, I got to bring the crowd back, Stevie. Thank you. Okay, everybody, this sounds like wonderful conversations, but we'll get a chance to go back to these perhaps a little bit later. But thank you for taking that time. I hope you had a chance to hear from each other some of what Linda's talk brought out for people. So Linda, there are many vignettes, many stories in your book that can't help but stick in one's mind. But there's one in particular that comes to me often, which is you and your partner one of the things you did was you went and visited cultural expressions of that time. And you went to a museum of one of the maybe militias or armed groups of the war period for Israel. And in looking through a set of photos of young people involved in that militia, you came across a woman who you recognized. And you tell the story of that in the book. Could you just share a little bit of that here?
Yeah. So the museum was the Palmach Museum, which was one of the militias that was formed before the War of Independence. And it really represented the most esteemed and adored militia it's the predecessor of the IDF, but it was very much of the Israeli left. They actually lived on kibbutzim, on collective farms, and trained on those farms, and worked all the daytime on the farm and trained at night. And they were the most dedicated and considered really the most adored of the Zionist fighters, and they were quite extraordinary people in many, many ways. Anyway, there was a museum commemorating that part of Israeli history, and there was an archive attached to the museum, and we went to the archive with another friend, an Israeli friend, Amira, and we were just leafing through photo albums that showed very generic photographs of a group of guys standing by a tank or making a human pyramid or, you know, swaggering with a gun or whatever soldiers kind of do in group photographs, essentially, in their relaxed non-combat moments. No combat photographs there. And I started looking for women among them, and there were many women in the Palmach, actually. And to my amazement, I came across a woman named Arna. Does anybody here know anything about Arna? So a few years ago, I forget which year it was, but it was exactly the year when Hamas was voted into the government of Gaza that year. Pardon? Well, it's not crucial, the exact year. Yeah. But a young, an Israeli-Palestinian man, Arna's son, Giuliano Meir, was here doing a tour of talking in this area, and he brought a film with him called Arna's Children. It is, for me personally, the most upsetting documentary imaginable about what is happening in this war. It begins with his mother, Arna, who was in the Palmach, married a Palestinian guy through the Israeli Communist Party, where she met him, had this man, Giuliano, who's both Palestinian and an Israeli Jew at the same time, and moved to Jenin. She moved to Jenin and started a children's theater. It's called the Freedom Theater. And in the movie, you see her working with these young kids, just doing psychodrama, essentially, as a kind of mental health activity. And you see her also with the mothers and with the community, and she's clearly adored by the people in the refugee camp of Jenin, which is where she's working. The problem with the film is that it continues over the years. And by the time the film reaches its end, only one of these children is still alive. So all these children whom you saw acting and having fun and joking, all of them became quote unquote freedom fighters, which some people call terrorists, you know, and they died in one confrontation with the Israeli army or another. It was very upsetting to see Arna in that particular situation, in that archive. And I said to the people with me, I said, look, who's Arna? Here is Arna. I was so surprised. And the attendant was a young woman in Israeli army uniform. And she came over and said, yeah, we also have a picture in the lobby at the entrance of Arna giving some, I don't remember if it's juice or cookies or something, to an old Palestinian man who's sitting on the ground. And we have that picture there to show that the Palmach was good. And by then I knew there were massacres. I knew there was a lot of death. It was no longer that image, but this woman didn't know it. And I didn't say a word. I didn't want her to know what's the real story by Arna. But actually, I came back about 2 years later, and I couldn't find the photograph on the wall anymore. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't know if have we gotten any questions from the audience? Any questions people want to ask?
We don't have any paper. We don't have any...
Oh.
Okay. So as soon as we get some questions, we'll start answering questions from the audience. But for now, I wanted to ask you, in your first reading, you mentioned this visit to the village in Galilee. And it's a powerful story at the beginning of your book, which is your encounter with a Palestinian man who owns a small shop. And being a good writer, you were trying to take notes about your visit, and you discovered that you didn't have a pen. You'd lost your pen, which is of course a great tragedy for a writer. So you went into this small shop and approached this man about whether or not you could purchase a pen from him. I wonder if you would tell what happened at that time and why it is you felt that it was a story that belonged at the beginning of your book.
Yeah, the book was written actually in bits and pieces, and the arrangement of what comes early and what comes later was like patchwork. At various points had an intuitive feeling that something needs to be in this location or that location. What to keep for the end was very important to me too. What happened there was that I was there with Zohot on the tour. People were walking up the hill, and actually I didn't lose my pen. That would be a very bad thing for a writer to do, but it ran out of ink, and I did need a pen. And there was a tiny little convenience store, jumbled kind of place, and I walked in, and I say to the guy, who's obviously Palestinian, I say to him, Shalom, in Hebrew. And I didn't feel like I should say Salam Alaikum or anything like that, because it felt phony. I mean, I was clearly an Israeli, I might as well just say it in Hebrew. And he was very cold. He said, basically, yeah. And I said, do you have, and I speak Hebrew because I can't speak Arabic. And he said, and I asked him if he has a pen. And instead of answering me, he says to me, are you with the Zohot tour? And I said, yes. And he gives me the pen and said, that's for you to keep. And I said, no, let me pay for it. And he said, no, you keep that. And that really, I left the shop. I had to rush to find the group before I lose my way. But what I realized while writing it in retrospect, I didn't pause to ask him his name. I didn't introduce myself and there wasn't that kind of connection happening. But, I mentioned when I describe it, I mean, it's a tiny little episode, but that I felt ashamed. I felt like I'm the intruder in his village, and the fact that he's grateful to me for being there with Zohot felt wrong. I mean, I was a part of the conquering army, the people who took the place away, and that village, which is a Palestinian village now, is really home primarily to dispossessed Palestinians from other villages. It's no longer the people of Tarshiha living there. It's people from here and people from there who came. So it was a kind of painful, sweet but painful moment where he was grateful to me for coming for this tour. And I felt like that's the least I can do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple questions from the audience. I'll share one and see where we go with it. I know you taught film at UMass.
Yeah.
Are there films you could recommend that can open American minds to a better understanding of the Israeli situation?
Well, the sweetest and saddest melancholy film is called The Inner Tour. It was done by a guy called Ranan Alexandrovich, but The Inner Tour, I hope it's available in some venue. It's a really lovely film. It takes place during the Oslo period when things seemed promising, and it's about a group of Palestinians leaving Ramallah and going for a tour inside the Green Line in Israel for 3 days. And you just see them visiting various locations, and you see them in conversation among themselves inside the tour bus. And it's a really, really beautiful movie, and I think a very good introduction. I think the most painful movie, or I don't know if the most, I mean, for me, Arna's Children is by far the hardest, but a very difficult movie that came out about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, is Tantura. It is available at Amazon and other places. It won a prize at Sundance film festival, and it is about a massacre that occurred in the village of Tantura, which is on the beach, not far from Caesarea. And the director, Alon Schwartz, is an Israeli director, was able to locate some of the veterans of the military group, the Alexandroni Brigade, that attacked Tantura, and interview them on film. It's a very, very disturbing film about a massacre. There are more. There were others. Maybe I'll read to you about another one later. But this is a very powerful movie. Both of these are made by Israeli. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Before we get to the next question, I just want to say that our encounters with books are never accidental. Excuse me. Excuse me. And this one was certainly not an accident for me. Sitting in the front row here are two dear friends of mine. One is Jack Spence and one is Catherine E. Jack has in common a long history of being a professor at UMass Boston. And Catherine has a long history of being connected to Jack. And one evening I was at their home having dinner, as I have been known to do over the last few years. And Catherine said to me, I've just come across this book by a friend of mine that I really think you would like. And when Catherine tells you, I don't know how many people here know Catherine, but when Catherine tells you you should pay attention to a book, it is a book that you should pay attention to. So it took me a little while. It sat on my bedstand for a period of time, but I did pick it up, and I never regretted it. And I think if any of you have a chance to get your hands on the book, you won't regret it either. And I say that just by way of a lead-in to the fact that Linda has brought some copies of the book here with her tonight, and they'll be available in the room at the back here at the end of this. And you're in a special place because Linda informed me, and this almost sounds like something you do in the old Red Book days, but Linda informed me that the book is out of stock at the publisher. So the ones we have here tonight are the very last ones you'll be able to get your hands on for some period of time. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, it is going into a second printing, which will be available in 6 to 8 weeks.
You don't have to tell them that. That takes a... What kind of a peddler are you? So we're going to come back to these questions, but I know you have a second piece that you'd like to read from the book.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you to do that. But before I do, I want to say that the book contains many different kinds of vignettes and stories. And in the story of Israel and Palestine, there are easier and much less easier stories to hear. Linda has said tonight that having some sense of the crowd she's speaking to, she would like to share with you one of the less easy stories to listen to from her book. But she asked that I let you know this beforehand, sort of like they do on NPR, tell you this, just so that you know that this deals with a difficult topic, one of many addressed in the book.
Okay, thank you. I do want to, since Kevin did a shout out to Catherine and Jack, I just want to say that Catherine actually read and caught many spelling errors in my early draft. Okay, and also, I just mentioned 2 Israeli movies, but there are a lot of Palestinian movies out. Most of them are documentaries, not feature films, but there is one called Salt of the Sea that is very lovely too that I want to just mention. I don't know if it's available. One evening in Zohot's gallery, I heard a lecture on the massacre that occurred in the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin, the most notorious of the 48 war massacres committed by people who were weaned on the legend of Tel Chai. That was a legend and a historical battle that occurred in the 1920s, and all the Jewish defenders of that village died at that time. So that was kind of a moment of heroism that we all grew up on. I already knew that this massacre was committed by members of the Jewish Irgun and the Lehi militias, though how many men, women, and children were actually slaughtered that day in April 9, 1948 is still unclear. Was it 254 killed, as some claim, 100 as others estimate, 116 as Zohot's booklet on Deir Yassin reports? Did the Haganah inflate the numbers in order to disgrace the Irgun and Lehi, as some alleged? And what happened to the survivors? The facts are not trivial. Reports of mass killing, torture, and humiliation abound, and new ones keep emerging. Atrocities inflicted on peaceful Palestinians who had ceasefire treaty with the Haganah and pleaded to be allowed to surrender. News of the massacre spread quickly, with a prisoner paraded in Jerusalem by their captors. It caused countless other Palestinians to flee without a shot being fired. Though the Irgun and Lehi's responsible for the Hamas, for the massacre is known, there are claims that the Haganah could have intervened and didn't. Sitting in the gallery's folding chairs with some 30 Israelis, middle-aged and older, I was stunned to see a stocky man rise to shout at the speaker across the room, his face red, his voice hoarse with age and rage, and the speaker responded in kind. Both were old enough to have fought in 48 and probably had. The facts and numbers of Deir Yassin's victims may be debated, but the furious rage that tilted these two aging men at each other transcended the facts. How long, I wondered, and continue to wonder, will we on all sides continue to nurse the ancient resentments, guilts, and shame? I did not expect such rage to erupt on the Zohot gallery floor, but the name of Deir Yassin festers as a dark, barely mentionable reminder of events we chose to bury but never quite managed to purge. As a child, I rarely heard Deir Yassin mentioned, though when it was the massacre and not the place that people had in mind. One snippet overheard shortly after the attack on the village haunts me. Something murdered about a woman's breast nailed to a door. To this day, I do not know whether the atrocity was actually committed, and if it was, whether it was perpetuated by us in Deir Yassin or by Palestinians in nearby Jewish Gush Etzion. Revenge and counter-revenge, and yet what flickers behind my unwilling eye is the image of a woman's breast, congealed blood at its rim, nailed to a wooden door. Until the War of 1967, when Israel came to control extensive new territories, Deir Yassin trembled at the edge of memory as the most painful test of our rules of engagement, those much-touted ethics of combat. It was a test we failed, where Tohar HaNeshek, the purity of the weapon, proved a lie. Whatever the facts, the numbers of those killed, the survivors paraded and executed, the atrocities, the testimonies of surviving witnesses on both sides, it was unbearable to imagine that our sons could be at fault. I'm going to read another section that relates to that. It concerns a trip that I took on foot to a village called Kalunia, which is just down the hill from Deir Yassin, with my friend Nurit and with her husband Amos Kenan. It was a lovely winter day, and Nurit's husband Amos came along, making it something like a family outing. For once, we also had a guide. Nurit knew the place and wouldn't lead us into a blind scramble. At the bottom of the hill, we found the remains of Kalunia, a few skeletal buildings and some rusting pieces of agricultural machinery. Whether Jewish or Palestinian was hard to say. What was unexpected had to do with Amos, not the place. Amos was now over 80, leaning on a cane and walking with difficulty. We had to go slowly so that he could keep up with us. But in 1947 and into 1948, until he joined the Haganah, Amos had been an active member of the radical Lehi Stern Gang militia, defined by its actions as a terrorist group, although it could easily qualify as anti-colonial freedom fighter label. Bridges were blown up, British soldiers killed randomly at close range. There was no hesitation about answering the call to blood and fire. On September 17, 1948, Lehi men assassinated the United Nations peace negotiator, Count Foch Bernadotte, changing what could have been a different course of history. Nurit had already told me that Amos was among those who attacked Deir Yassin in 48. What I did not realize as we started walking towards Kalunia was that he was suffering from dementia. None of us spoke on the way downhill, but once we reached Kalunia's derelict houses, memories of that horrific assault crowded in on Amos. He paused and, leaning on a cane, was urgently trying to tell me something. Starting off and restarting, his speech was slurred and incoherent. The occasional phrases, words, and names tumbled out as we talked. The shooting, Deir Yassin, at the gate, the sounds of, I was left. Deir Yassin, they entered, he carried me. Deir Yassin, the sounds, he was wounded in Deir Yassin. A well-known journalist, author, artist, and public intellectual, he had been there during the attack on Deir Yassin, wounded during the battle. When, where, and how is unclear. Perhaps it was early on at the gate, as he often claimed. Perhaps it was inside the village, as he once or twice conceded to Nurit. Perhaps an hour or so into the battle, but perhaps earlier. Perhaps he really didn't see anything. Perhaps he really couldn't remember. I later read Nurit's book, Unrepented, 4 chapters in the life of Amos Kenan, which included lengthy excerpts from her interviews with him. In them, Nurit is persistent, Amos intractable, increasingly irritable, even hostile. I don't remember, I don't know, don't remember, didn't see, not exactly, apparently, and then again, don't remember. Then, as Nurit's questions close in on whether he killed a Palestinian woman, no, I don't remember something, that is a weapon in my hand, he says, and I'm getting fed up with this interview. I didn't remember that I shot a woman. I didn't remember, but apparently I shot. Apparently it was a woman. It's impossible to be clear about what Amos did at the time or said about it later. And that's probably how he wanted it, dementia or not. It's a story wrapped in contradictions and crazed with blind alleys, recorded before he retreated into dementia and made more confused by the time he was trying to tell me about it. Garbled memory, I now think, is a good way to hide. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
don't you look at that one and see?
How can we overcome the dehumanization and demonization that both sides use to justify violence against each other? How can we overcome it? You know, I'm an educator, and I think we have to educate ourselves, but we have to be willing. I mean, I went through a very difficult journey, as I write about here, in actually leaving where I was as an unreconstructed, totally naive Zionist, and allowed myself to ask these questions. People are so afraid and so pained and angry. Both sides are full of desire for revenge. It's very, very, very hard to move beyond that. I only can say reading, education, soul-searching, prayer, any mode of spiritual connection to humanity. I mean, part of me says that both the Palestinians and the Israelis need mass psychotherapy. They are all traumatized, all of them, truly, and now will be even worse. You know, what do we do? How many therapists do we have? And how much honesty we have is part of the question. So, you know, what can I do with that? Yeah.
So, as you've heard, Linda began writing this book quite some time ago, and the process that led to it began even before that. But now we're living in a different moment, and I think a lot of you, some of you at least, are here because of what's going on in that region right now, and needing to find ways to think about that and process and understand what's going on. So if we can, we'd like to take another minute and ask you just to turn to somebody, maybe the same person you spoke to last time, and just, I mean, I know some of you haven't read the book, some of you have, but just speak a little bit about how you see the relevance of Linda's experience as she captured it in this book to our effort to understand what's going on now and how to respond to that. So would people just take a moment, turn to somebody, and talk about that for a couple of minutes?
It's the old question.
Why don't you look at these questions and see if there's any in particular you want or don't want to. That one you already did. I'm not sure I quite understand that one. Is she quoting something from your book?
Probably. Revenge and anger and bitterness. I may speak to the role of the British government, I can say very briefly.
That one you've already read.
Sunday's Time magazine, yeah, about the ultra-right, yeah. I'll talk about that briefly, I can just kind of acknowledge it. And do you know of a group standing together? Do you know who Standing Together is? I mean, there are many such groups. Do you know them specifically?
I don't know that specifically.
I don't know me would, but... Okay, I'll comment very briefly and then ask about the longer question. Yeah. The man who's talking, I don't know who he is, who's talking with Naomi. When you raised the question, he was doing like, you know, what can we do?
He spent a lot of time as a young man in Israel. I don't know if he was in the IDF, but he was certainly mobilized.
Yeah.
And has become a very strong anti-Zionist force.
Yeah.
Old friend of mine.
Well, that's nice.
They're a good pair.
Yeah. Yeah. There was an article in this week in New York Times, yesterday's Times, about the occupied territories, not about Gaza, and the way they are harassing.
Okay, friends, we're going to probably not fair to get you started on these conversations and then stop them. But that's exactly what we're going to do. If you can hear me, clap one. All right, thank you all. That seems to have worked pretty well. I hope you enjoyed those conversational interludes. So we're going to go back to a couple of questions that have come from the audience. So take it away, Linda.
Okay. One of them is just a question of factual information about the role of the British government or the British Empire in creating the State of Israel. So just if you don't know, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, France and Britain divided the Middle East between them. France got Syria and Lebanon, Britain got Palestine and Iraq. You know, they just felt that they can have it, essentially. But so basically between 1917 or 19, depending how you think it, until 47, the British basically ruled Israel. So when I talked before about attacks on the British, it was part of the anti-colonial Israeli Jewish struggle to get rid of them, but the Palestinians also wanted to get rid of them. The problem was that we were not making a common cause, but we were fighting one another as well as the British. So that's very briefly that, but I should mention, very important, also the British during and after World War II did not allow Jewish refugees from Europe into Israel. And this is something that is important to me because I feel like in many ways the State of Israel was created not only by the British, but by the Soviet Union and by the United States, by all of them basically engineering non-refuge for the Holocaust survivors. And we need to know that we here have a very important role in that. So that's one question that was raised. Another question that I will only comment very briefly on was that this Sunday's Time magazine ran an article describing the ultra-right, pardon? This says Time magazine.
New York Times.
Maybe both, I don't know. Certainly the New York Times, which I did see, but maybe also, anyway, describing the ultra-right elements arising from the settlement. I do think it's a New York Times article, very powerful one, and also the settlement culture that is sitting in Netanyahu's government. And definitely that is happening, but it has been a crawling process. It doesn't begin now, and it didn't begin with Netanyahu. And anybody who thinks that if we get rid of Netanyahu, everything will be better, has another question coming, because the Israeli public is supporting that. And I know that some of you will know that there were big anti-government demonstrations going on in Israel, but they were all only about the change in the law, in the government law and the Supreme Court that Netanyahu was trying to do, mainly to save his ass from criminal charges. But in those demonstrations, you rarely saw the Palestinian flag, and I don't think that there is that much of a movement in Israel, but there are organizations like that. And it's really important to know not only B'Tselem, which is a human right, very important human rights organization, but Doctors for Human Rights and Rabbis for Human Rights, and many other organizations in Israel that have been working, but they're small. That's the problem. And there are many organizations here, and actually what we've seen recently, because of the bombing of Gaza, is a mass mobilization of people who until now have not been active at all. So who knows what the future is bringing. Now, here is a question that's more complicated. This person is quoting from Deborah, and I don't remember in the book that particular quotation, but it makes sense to me. She says, all that bitterness passing for strength. And the writer asks, Is this regarding revenge, anger, and trauma? And I answer, yeah, that what I feel in Israel is very much, and among the Palestinians in a very different way and for very different reasons, is that there is profound psychic wounding coming from their histories. For us, it is definitely anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust, but we have to remember that the early Zionism was not because of the Holocaust, but because of pogroms in Eastern and Central Europe. Okay, so it is a longer process, and I actually write in the book about a history that goes all the way back to the Spanish Inquisition and so on. There are ongoing and ongoing traumas that define the Israeli pain that made the feeling that we need to hold on to this land, our land. But meanwhile, there is the Palestinian pain, and the Palestinian pain is about how we dispossessed them. And not only we, but the world in general, and the world in general is still ignoring them. They're basically throwing them under the bus again and again. In all the treaties and all the discussions and all the UN initiatives, their voice is not being heard. And that is part of the traumas that they're dealing with. We Israelis have a big voice at this point. So the issue is, yeah, there is a lot of bitterness. But bitterness, how do you cope with it? I mean, on trauma, it's the issue of, are you going to run away, or are you going to stand up and fight? And what both Israelis and Palestinian militants are choosing is to fight. And that fighting is not going to help remove the trauma. It's just being basically killing one another, essentially. We can talk, I mean, this is a very big question. The same question is, how do you bring change into the situation? The other question is, please speak to the parts in your book about the Jewish racism regarding Ashkenazi and Mizrahi and Sephardic. Yeah, so I do talk about that. And I gather that actually, I heard recently in another talk somebody saying, well, this whole war is just about racism. It's the white people against the dark-colored people. And that is really inaccurate, but there has been a lot of racism among us Israelis, and I do talk about it in the book. And you can talk about the Israeli attitude towards the Palestinians as ethnic prejudice that has definitely a racist feel to it, you know. I'm saying feel because it's kind of weird, because there are a lot of Arab Jews who are fighting the Palestinians, so they come from the same racial community. It's like blacks against blacks in a way, or one Native American tribe against another. You know, the element of racism is more complicated, and I do want to say, and I do show it in the book, that the issue of race and social class are inseparable from one another. It is always the question of privilege and those who have and those who don't have, and sometimes it manifests itself through skin color or some other cultural or physical dimension, and sometimes not. It's very, very hard to separate that, but definitely in Israel, the disenfranchised Jewish group were the people coming from the East, both from North Africa and from Asia, whether they were Indian, East Indian Jews, Kurdish Jews, Arab Jews, Iraqi Jews, Moroccan Jews, Egyptian Jews. That whole swath of people were seen as the underclass. Yemenite Jews were all seen as the underclass in Israel by the ruling elite, which was Ashkenazi, which means coming from Europe, basically. And you can see to this day in the differences between privileges of the groups. I saw it most recently seeing new housing built for immigrants from Russia and immigrants from Ethiopia. And there is a difference in quality of housing, with the Russians being white, getting the better housing, and the Ethiopians being black, getting the worse housing, side by side. You know, it's just transparent. So definitely there was that. At the same time, people are marrying across the differences, and people are serving in the army across differences. And if there's anything good I can say about the army, it is actually that it is an opportunity for people to work side by side with people that socially they would have never worked with otherwise. And there is something to be said for that. I wish it were volunteering to build schools and hospitals rather than fight to kill people. But it creates a kind of brotherhood that is quite interesting and important. Yeah. What is that? Dr. Phil interviewed me and what? And
I can't read it.
oh,
Netanyahu.
oh.
So I was wondering if you saw that interview and had any thoughts on it or...
I couldn't hear the question.
Dr. Phil interviewed Netanyahu, I think it was very recently, and I was wondering if you saw any thoughts on Netanyahu's positions on...
I hate to tell you, I can't hear you.
Dr. Phil interviewed Netanyahu. I was wondering if you saw that interview because he filmed it and stuff, or thoughts on Netanyahu's position. I don't know whether he's trying to keep Israel from being destroyed from his position. And I'm not speaking for the interview or anything. I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
You didn't see Dr.
I didn't see the interview. I actually don't know who Dr. Phil is.
Count your lucky stars.
So
It is
I
just as well.
apologize. I guess I can't answer that.
I think that's...
Whatever Netanyahu said in that interview, he's extremely slidey and hard to pin down. He's an excellent politician in that sense. And right now, as you may know, there is a challenge to him that either he comes for a plan for this or the companion party is going to leave. And I'm quite expecting him to come with an answer that will figure enough as an answer and answer nothing at the same time, which is what Harvard did apparently with the students who demonstrated. Yeah.
It says, maybe there's one more question here that you would say something about, which is, what similarities have you seen between social justice movements in the United States and the Palestinian movement for freedom?
Well, there definitely is the justice movements here are more, at least when let's say the civil rights movement, the Vietnam movement, the grape boycott that we had for some years, these were local to us except for Vietnam. The Vietnam War was seen as an imperialist war. Martin Luther King defined it as such broadly. And the questions about what we are doing there was definitely there. One of the things that I remember from that time is a kind of separation or disjunction within the pro-peace or anti-war movement, that there were people who were saying, look what we're doing to Vietnam. But there were other people who were mainly saying, bring our boys back home. And these are two very different political agendas, I think. So the question is, to me, to what extent the American social justice movements were more insular, more about us and what we are doing, and to what extent they really were anti-colonial movements. Now, we have had groups active, including Kevin, in Latin America and in other places where we asked ourselves, and try to, in some way, create support for people in Nicaragua, whatever. There has been that, but I think it hasn't been the same as the Palestinians fighting to protect their own land. I think, if anything, the parallel will be much more to Native Americans. Leonard Peltier, for example, okay, Wounded Knee. So, or even people standing on Thanksgiving Day at Plymouth and having a protest event at Plymouth on Thanksgiving. You know, so I think that is the parallel for us. One of the things that's striking about the Palestinian resistance movement, though, is the way that they were informed by international struggles. They were reading Fanon. They were reading about what was happening in Nicaragua. They knew about Castro. You know, they were, and their opportunity to know all of that was in prison. So many Palestinians were in prison in Israel, having the chance to have study groups and discuss the issue of post-colonialism or anti-colonialism and struggle, Che Guevara, you know, all of that. So I think that in a way it was a more cosmopolitan movement than the American ones. It saw itself much more clearly in an international context than at least what my personal understanding of American social justice movements tend to be. I think that one of the things that falls kind of out of sight did here, to my mind, a fair amount, and I think there too, is that class struggle doesn't figure in all of that clearly. And I think that that's because we are still living with the consequences of the Cold War, distrust of Russia, distrust of communism. And Russia actually played a very complicated role. You asked about the British, but Russia actually supported the creation of Israel and gave Israel most of its arms in the 48 war. They came from Czechoslovakia, and I trained on a Czech gun. So we need to remember who is who and who is on what side. And Russia afterwards switched, but that was for purely opportunistic reasons. They discovered that the Israeli left, which they were counting on, was not sufficiently left and wasn't as obedient to them as they wanted. So they switched to be anti-Israeli, trying to recruit the Arabs instead, the Arab world, not just the Palestinians. But I think it's really important to get a global sense of liberation movement. Think about India. Think about the anti-British struggle in India and the horrible partition that they went through, a murderous partition, as a result of their independence. And India to this day is still undergoing many partitions. So the state of Andhra Pradesh is divided into two. The Punjab is separating. And then we had the Bangladesh war. So, you know, we are dealing actually with the consequences of long-term Western colonialism. And in the Middle East, ever since the Ottoman Empire fell. And I think that people who are involved in social justice, it helps to know that there's a connection between them, even if each one is specific to its own country. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I was just going to ask you for an applause, and you anticipated my request. Very clever. We did commit to Linda that we would try and close this by 8 p.m. I want to remind you again that there will be some books in the back if you're interested. And I just want to spend 1 second thanking all of you once more for spending a piece of your very delightful Monday evening sitting here with us tonight. It means a lot to us as a congregation to be able to have all of you and to see many faces here who are people that we don't know. There are a lot of familiar faces here, but thankfully, many less familiar. So it's great to see you all. So I would like one more applause just for all of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.
And before we finish, we have Diana's list has a tiny token of appreciation for Linda's presence here. If we don't fall down trying to. Thank you. So, as we said in the beginning, music's an important part of what we do here. We began with some music filling this room, and if Dean will indulge us, we would like to end in that same way. Adelante.
Yeah, please. You have to raise it.
That, and like that. Little higher, little higher, little higher. I want to thank my colleague Amar Ahmad for helping me with live stream. We have probably we know of about 60 other people who are out there on YouTube and Facebook and X, and we're just streaming on multiple platforms at Community Church. I invite you to check out our YouTube channel. We have a ton of really wonderful speakers and musicians, tons of concerts. And we have this, so you can tell folks to long into the future, until YouTube censors us, listen to Linda Dittmar's talk at Theodore Parker Church. I've got one last song for you. It's sort of from the mouth of babes. The author of this song is 24 years old. She lives in Egypt. Her name is Iman Askar. And this is a melody that's a sea shanty. It's either, I don't know, it's either a sea shanty or it's a theme song from some like 60s TV sitcom. One of the two. You can maybe tell me, but I love this song, From the Mouth of Babes. It's like this conflict. There's been so much written about it, and it keeps on going, and there's so many different experts that you need to know about. This is just a simple little description. There once was a land called Palestine, where Christians, Muslims, Jews lived fine. In the 1800s it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile a bearded guy founded Zionism for Jews to aspire, a land that became their home and safe only for their kind. Then there was World War I that ended when the Allies won, and England was like, hey, this beautiful land is totally mine. Still the name was Palestine, even though it was colonized, and a promise for a Zionist state was made by a man that had no right. Then there was more and more Jews arrived seeking refuge, and that's all right, until their plan to steal the land was no longer to hide. The year was 1948, when Israel bullied its way into a state, and thousands of Palestinians fled their homes just to survive. No right to return, no right to a home, no right to fight for the land they own. Israel expanded more and more into an apartheid. Where is your humanity? Where is your respect for dignity? Call it conflict, that's insanity. It's time to change your mind. One day Palestine will be free, so be on the right side of history. You're not anti-Semitic if you stand against war crimes. Don't be brainwashed by the news. Now you can see for yourself their truth. Learn about the story of Palestine. Any last words? Okay.